mozzarella like what's used on Neapolitan style pizza, but I'm also going to attempt a more low moisture version like what's used on pretty much all other styles of pizza, at least here in the US. And making fresh mozzarella is pretty easy in theory. It can be done in less than an hour with just 3 or 4 ingredients. But as I started my usual research on YouTube, I noticed that nearly every recipe I found was slightly different from the last. And I'm not the type of person to just blindly pick a recipe and follow it, so this meant that I had to start from the beginning to figure out what cheese actually is and understand at least the basic science behind how it's made. Which led me to this book, Mastering Basic Cheese Making by Gianna Caldwell. It explains everything you need to know to get started in cheese making, and it has recipes for pretty much all the fundamentals of cheese making. In its simplest form, cheese is just milk that's first been soured, either through fermentation or the addition of acid, then coagulated in order to isolate the proteins and fats of the milk, or in other words, to drive off some of the moisture from it. It's then salted for flavor and or preservation, and sometimes the cheese is further aged to remove more moisture and to develop some different flavors, which is actually a pretty simple process when you break it down, and making mozzarella is probably one of the easiest ways to demonstrate it, so let's give it a try. And step 1 is to sour our milk. So by the way, regular grocery store milk works fine. It can be pasteurized just as long as it's not ultra pasteurized. You do want to use whole milk if you can for the best flavor though. So I'm going to use about 2 quarts here, which is half a gallon. Now I mentioned that the souring can be done via fermentation, and that's how it's typically done in a commercial setting. Either a powdered culture would be added to the milk, or a sample from the previous day's batch would be added sort of as like a starter to get the fermentation going. However, there is a simpler solution, which is just to add a little bit of acid to your milk in order to bring down the pH. But this is where it got a little confusing when I was watching some video tutorials, because everyone was using a different form of acid. Some people would use vinegar, some would use lemon juice, some would use citric acid, and it wasn't until I started reading this book that it made a lot more sense. As the author explains it, any edible acid can be used to make cheese, but the type of acid you use might impart a little bit of flavor into the cheese.
Sí, por supuesto.
For me though, since I want the most neutral flavor possible for this initial test, I'm just going to use this citric acid. So I need 3/4 teaspoon for this amount of milk, and I need to dissolve that in 1 tablespoon of water just to make sure that I can distribute it more evenly. So we'll just go ahead and add that in. And with that, step 1 of souring the milk is all done, and we can move on to step 2, which is to coagulate the milk, which sort of has 2 parts to it. The first is to bring the milk to the right temperature. We just need to heat it up a little bit, in this case to about 88 to 90 degrees Fahrenheit. But since we need to maintain a pretty precise temperature range, I've created a little double boiler mechanism here. So I've got a nice heavy pot full of water, and I'm just gonna place my plastic container into that pot so that the milk can slowly come to temperature. Heat alone though isn't gonna be enough to help this milk coagulate. So what we need is also to add something called rennet. So just like the citric acid, you can buy it online. I got mine on Amazon. It may also be available at some home brewing stores or health food stores. So instructions say 1/4 tablet sets a gallon of milk. Now we want to stir the milk using an up and down motion, stirring briefly.
Para producir el mozzarella necesitas la acidez correcta. Puedes dejar fermentándolo naturalmente, que sería lo correcto, o podrías ponerle ácido cítrico.
Keep the milk as still as possible here, and then you want to let the curds set until a clean break is achieved, which it says should take just about 5 minutes. Alright, so we just need to make a small cut, lift up. Oh wow, it's a very clean cut. I think we're ready to go ahead and cut this curd. Now one thing I noticed was that my temperature carried up to about 108 degrees Fahrenheit. Hopefully that'll be okay. I mean, it looks pretty good so far. But the next step is to cut it into 1/4 inch to 1/2 inch cubes. This rectangular container makes that pretty easy. So we're gonna go ahead and cut all the way horizontally, every 1/2 inch to 1/4 inch. So now what we wanna do is, it says heat the curds very gradually, stirring gently to 105 degrees Fahrenheit over about 5 to 10 minutes. Like I said, we're already at about like 109 right now. So I'm just gonna leave the heat off and just go ahead and stir these gradually for 5 to 10 minutes. Alright, so it's been about 7 minutes. I've kept it between about 100 and 105 degrees this whole time. So I'd say we can...
Pregunto, ¿quedará bueno? No creo. No creo.
move on to the next step, which is to drain out the whey. So we're gonna need to heat up the whey again. So I'm gonna put it back into my pot here, which means I need to dump out the existing water and then go ahead and drain it right back off. And what we should be left with in this pot is just the whey. So technically we do have cheese here. I mean, cheese curds, but cheese either way. Obviously it doesn't quite look like the mozzarella that we all know and love though, because there is one more step in order to make this a proper mozzarella, and that is to stretch the curds and shape it into a mozzarella ball. So to do that, we need to heat up our whey to 130 degrees Fahrenheit. And we also need to add a little bit of salt here for flavor. Only 1¼ grams is what it calls for here. I feel like I might end up preferring a little bit more, but we'll just go by the book for now. Basically, again, we're just looking to warm up the whey so that we can then put some of the curd back into it to kind of soften it to make it able to be stretched and shaped. Which gives me just enough time to complete the essence of the craft. Babel is one of the top conversations. The lessons, which are created by actual language teachers, prepare you to have practical grammar, important different topics. And so I'm gonna try to kind of stretch this out. It's definitely stretching a little bit. It's as if it's not stretching easily though, to bump up the temperature another 10 degrees. We'll go up to like 140. Starting to stretch, definitely starting to stretch. I think part of it's you just need to give the curd time to soften up in that liquid. But I would also say using a slightly higher temperature is probably a good idea. Yeah, I think I might have overworked this a little bit just because I was messing around with it, but looks pretty good. I think I can go ahead and move on to the rest of my mozzarella. Go ahead and drop her in. Give it maybe 1 to 2 to 3 minutes. Give it another try here. Stretching a little bit. Again, I think it just needs more temperature. I'm gonna bump up the heat just a little bit more. Maybe try to get it to like 150 degrees. There we go. Now it's stretching. Wow. Add it to my cold water, and we got our mozzarella. Obviously, what I'm very curious about though is to see how they taste. So for the sake of comparison, I also got some store-bought mozzarella. This is Belgioioso brand, the one I typically buy. So I want to see if my homemade stuff actually tastes any better. Texturally, mine's definitely a bit softer. I don't know if it's a lower moisture content or what, but let's cut into mine and see what it looks like. I mean, it looks like you would expect. Store-bought means good. A little bit salty, but overall, I mean, not really too much flavor to it. Let's try my homemade stuff. Definitely needs a lot more salt. Next time I'd probably add salt directly to the curd. I don't know if that would have any other negative impacts, but otherwise though, I mean, the flavor's quite a bit different. This has a lot, I mean, for lack of a better term, fresher, more cheesy flavor to it. Where, like I said, the store-bought one just really doesn't taste like anything. The true test though, and really the whole reason that I did this in the first place, was to see how it melts on a pizza. And I just so happen to have a couple doughs ready to go, so let's give it a try. Alright, so I've got my store-bought cheese right here. My fresh cheese is still in the oven, but I want to cut into this before it cools down too much. Visually though, I mean, it looks really good. I was aiming for sort of a Neapolitan style pizza, of course, given that we're using fresh mozzarella. So I baked at my oven's highest possible temperature on my baking steel for about 2 minutes, and then I moved it up to the very top rack and broiled it for the last minute. So only a 3-minute total bake, and you can see the cheese didn't really brown too much. It just sort of melted nicely, which is exactly what you want with a Neapolitan style pizza. Pretty much exactly what I would expect. Like I said, the cheese melted nicely without browning or burning too much. I mean, you can tell that it was baked in a home oven. It's not going to be as soft and gooey as it should be if we were to bake in a proper, you know, wood-fired oven, but pretty much as close as we're going to get at home. Now, I think my other pizza is ready. Looks very interesting here. You can see the cheese didn't really melt and become gooey the way that it should. Browned a little bit. You know, it's got some stretchiness to it, but not exactly what I would hope
porque es que lo logra la acidez del fermento.
So flavor-wise, it tastes pretty much the same as it did raw. Weirdly, the texture is almost the same too. It didn't really melt or do anything. It kind of just browned a little bit on the top. Maybe dried out just slightly. But definitely wasn't exactly the result that I was hoping for. I mean, it was my first attempt ever at making cheese, so I can't complain too much. I'm sure there's some things that I could do better. The problem is just that I don't know exactly what I need to fix in order to improve that issue. But let me do a little bit more research and see if I can't figure it out. So I dove back into my book, and sure enough, there was...
Bueno, ya sabemos el resultado. Vamos a adelantar un poco.
how it's made. To sort to get the cheese to kind of melt to the point that I can stretch it. So that's something to note for the next time I try to make this low moisture version. Now we just gotta wait for this to cool down and we'll give it a try. Alright, so this cheese has been cooling for about 10 minutes and I'm ready to do some investigation here. First thing I want to know is what was my yield here? So again, I used a half gallon of milk, which resulted in 196 grams or about 7 ounces of low moisture cheese. But point is, per gallon of milk, that would be about 13 to 14 ounces. Now I've also got some store-bought low moisture mozzarella here for comparison. Obviously right off the bat, you can tell mine is quite a bit lighter in color. Could be due to the type of milk used, but the darker color also can indicate some aging. Texture wise, mine does seem a little moister than the store-bought, but I'm really curious to give this a try. So let's see what we're working with. Store-bought. Just to kind of set my baseline. Otherwise, it does still need more. It's kind of got stringy layers to it. Stretch the cheese out at the end, and then I could have kind of formed it into a more cohesive shape, especially with like a proper cheese mold or something like that. Otherwise, I'm pretty impressed with the texture. It maybe does have a slight graininess to it, so I'm interested if that's going to mean that it's going to separate again. Right here. I don't judge it too early, but visually you can tell there's a pretty big difference here. The store-bought mozzarella melted super nicely, looks to be pretty kind of gooey and melty, whereas mine sort of did what that initial fresh mozzarella I made did.
Y no es que sepan distinto, es que igual uno no derrite tanto porque no fue suficientemente fermentado. Es el gran tema, ¿no? Y no tiene que fermentar tanto tampoco, es simplemente que llegue el nivel de acidez necesario para que se produzca todo esto. Creo que le dicen el hilo, porque tienen que sacarlo y tienen que dejar como un hilo. Cuando está así es que es el momento para hacer mozzarella. Tengo entendido. Bueno, espero les haya gustado. Saludos. Chao, chao.